Okay, our last bit of the session, quick chat about how to answer questions, some little bit of background to help prepare you. So you need to split every question into the task words, content words, limiting words, and the mark and time allocation. So we'll start with the mark and time allocation. Look at how many marks you can get as a maximum for your question. And as an average rule, you need to answer at a rate of 1.5 minutes per mark because that's exam timing. Now, you need to be familiar with task words. You'll find this in your textbook and make sure you really are all across this and learn this. They tell you how your answer has to be crafted. So this is words like evaluate, discuss, critically evaluate, identify. For each task word, it tells you a specific structure that you need to follow to get the full marks for your question. Okay. For example, a discuss question means you need to give advantages and disadvantages of a process, where an evaluate task word means you need to state strengths and weaknesses of a process. Now, content words tell you what section of the study design the question is about. So these are directly to do with the part of the study design that you were looking at when you were looking at everything that would be assessed. It's something from the study design, okay? This is why it's so important to work closely with your study design. And the limiting words tell you what not to write. For example, if a question says give one example of something, if you try to give two examples, you've just wasted your time because your response will not be marked past the point of the first example. Okay, so I see some students like get really confused and they don't really know anything about the process. They see a limiting word like one example, so they think, ah, the most I can muster is like a short definition or description. So what I'll just do is I'll instead give two examples, but I'll only give a tiny bit of detail for each one because I don't really know either. That student would get no marks or like 1 mark because they've passed the first example, nothing is going to be marked, and they've barely put anything down for their first example because they don't really know it. So if you see a limiting word like one example, it means give as much detail as possible to one example and don't put a second one down, because past the point that you literally mention a second example, even if you go back to the first and still keep writing about it later on, it's not going to get marked. It's not allowed to get any marks past that point. So just gives you an example. Our task word is discuss, meaning give advantages and disadvantages for this process. Limiting word is to. So we looked at the key personnel. Remember, judge, jury, parties, and legal personnel, the lawyers. So we need to choose two that we are most confident in. For example, two responsibilities that we're confident in. And it asks about legal personnel. The content word, it takes us to the part in the study design where it says you need to know the key responsibilities of all personnel in a trial, and civil in particular. So we can still use, when we say legal personnel, we're talking about the lawyers specifically, okay? And we need to choose two responsibilities. And the mark allocation of 4 marks tells us we should spend 6 minutes on this question. And it also pretty much tells us how much detail we should go into. 2 marks for each responsibility, as we can see. Gives you an idea about the level of detail. So, a little introduction for you guys on task words. Discuss is for and against arguments. Evaluate is strengths and weaknesses, essentially. If a question asks you to what extent, you must state the extent. So you can say things like to a large extent, to a moderate extent, to a low extent, and then that must match what kind of points you give in your body. So if I say to a moderate extent, it means I'm aiming to have pretty much an equal amount of strengths and weaknesses for that process. if I say it does achieve the principles of justice to a large extent, to a high extent, that means my response must border on having more strengths, okay? Because I said to a large extent, it does achieve. Compare questions, you need to give similarities and differences for a process. So, for example, compare, um, CAV and Consumer Affairs Victoria and VCAT, okay? And we looked at a table before. I showed you a cheat table. You would need to write about both similarities and differences. Distinguish means you need to write about differences. And you need to use words like whereas, on the other hand. If you don't use any distinguishing word, you will lose a mark for structure. So you can use, try to do it every single time you switch between one thing to another, to just say whereas process B, or on the other hand, process B is different because, okay. And in general, try to signpost your answers in legal studies to make it clear to your assessor that you're doing what the question wants. And breakdown of the time limits to show 1.5 minute per mark is what? As I mentioned, it's exactly like your end of year exam. All right, and lastly, when studying, I really want to stress that focus on making sure that you understand and know things first before you apply them. So you need to do a lot of practice questions in this subject to do well and prepare yourself for the exam. But only do these after you've learned the content and you're certain that you understand it. Then have a go at applying, okay? I'll just have some water, guys. So find the ways that are effective ways for you to study, but I do recommend some that are really good, including flashcards, making summaries, because there is a lot of overload of information. I do recommend having good notes in this subject, but try to summarize it and condense the amount of information. Flashcards might be a great way to achieve that. Working closely with the study design is crucial for every student that wants to do well in the subject. Explaining and teaching concepts to other people will help you remember them really, really well. Do lots of timed practice exams and timed practice questions. Every single time you learn a new bit of content, try to do some questions for it. So every single time, you complete a textbook mini section, do the textbook questions of different types, and do that with timed conditions. Remember, only after you understand the content and know it, though. So check that you remember first and then try to apply. Don't waste time. Make sure you can do a closed book, okay? Otherwise, there's very little benefit if you have to open your notes and check the content. Use examiner's reports. Mark yourself and feedback yourself every single time. Have notes on, information that you got wrong in a question. Make notes for yourself. Work closely with your teacher to get feedback from your teacher on what you need to change and do better to get full marks. Similarly, if you're doing practice exam questions and you're marking yourself, mark yourself based on the examiner's report and make notes on how to improve. Brainstorming and mind maps and Kahoots and all of that can be effective as well for testing your memory of content. You can use your teachers to ask for to explain content you don't fully get, and make sure you do that, and make sure you participate in class discussion. But you can also ask your teachers for extra resources. Like my legal studies teacher was able to give me extra practice exams. I completed all that were available that were relevant to my study design, and I ran out and I just asked my teacher, and she had exams from different companies, and she just gave them to me. So use your teachers, try to get help from them, and use a few different techniques to study, not just one. Another important tip, because you will have a 10 marker on your exam, that's worth about 15% of your total exam marks and is holistically marked based on the quality of the entire response, meaning that it is very difficult to get, really high marks because it's like a mini essay and the quality of it has to be really good and it needs to have great coverage. 10 markers are not easy. So, not now, but when you start getting into the new term and you finally learned some content that there is sufficient information to create a 10-mark question, start doing a 10 marker every week on every big concept that you've learned. Like key personnel is a suitable option that we looked at for 10 markers, for example. And constantly revise your content. Don't fall into the trap of having to learn things again and really struggling to do so. Revise everything as soon as you learn it and just let it pile up through the year. Don't make it difficult for yourself. You don't want to forget all of Unit 3 pretty much by the time you finish studying Unit 4 and exams are approaching. All right, thank you so much for watching, everyone, and coming along to this lecture. I hope you found it really useful. Just want to say best of luck for the rest of the year with legal studies. Thank you, everyone.